Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this amazing presentation that we are looking forward to on the impact of Brexit. We have lots of terrific other seminars coming up. I would like to draw your attention to our seminar on Monday, April 19th, Straight Talk on the Home Safety Sisters, all about home safety. I really encourage you to join us for that. We also have another of our Professor Emeriti joining us on Thursday, April 22nd, and that's Professor Emeritus Stephen Adler, who will be presenting Backstage on Broadway. How exciting to think that we'll be looking forward to soon the reopening of Broadway with vaccinations flowing out. But today we're here to talk about Brexit, and we have Professor Powell to do that. Hello?
Hello.
Oh, I thought I heard someone interrupting. Henry Powell is Professor Emeritus of Pathology at UC San Diego School of Medicine. He is a graduate of University College Dublin, and his MD and D science degrees are from the National University of Ireland. Professor Powell served as faculty member at UC San Diego from 1976 to 2005, including serving as the Neuropathology Division Head and as interim chair of pathology. He continues to teach courses in the School of Medicine. Additionally, Professor Powell served a 2-year tenure, first as vice chair, then as chair of the UC Academic Senate in Oakland, and also as the chair of the UCSD Emeriti Mentor Program. He is an active mentor in the Chancellor Scholars Program, and he presently serves as the chair of CUSIA, the Council of UC Emeriti Associations. As you can tell, Professor Powell is a busy man, but we know Professor Powell as a Renaissance man. With his wide-flung interests in classical music, he taught for 2 years a series on classical music appreciation for the RA. International films, he's presented several films for our international film series, and history and current affairs pertaining to England, Ireland, and Brexit. Let's welcome now Professor Henry Powell. Go ahead, Henry.
Thank you very much indeed for the very warm and kind welcome. And I'd like to just mention on classical music that I just bought a program called Audacity, which hopefully will allow me to cite segments of tracks on CDs, which means it'll be possible to talk about recording classical music again, something for the future. Today, I'm very pleased to have an opportunity to talk about Brexit, which has become a major international issue and an enormous problem within the community of nations that includes the European Union and also what some call the British Isles or the Atlantic Archipelago. Now, I became interested in Irish and English history when I was young. And when you are interested in the relationship between countries, it makes following the news a lot of fun. And I remember as a kid in the debating society having a talk there on the idea of the European Union and how it would be a good thing for Ireland to join. And the trouble was at that time that Ireland was so economically linked to Great Britain that the possibility of becoming an independent member within the European Union was just not there. It wasn't economically realistic, but that changed. And what I realized as an individual is that whatever island you're born on, the entire heritage of European history is something that belongs to you, and it's interesting to learn about. Now, if I may have the first slide. Thank you very much, Vanya and Suzanne, for running the slides for me.
Anthony, advance. Just say next each time.
Okay,
There
here
you
we go. Here we go. So what I'm showing here is a map of Great Britain and Ireland. And the first thing I would just like to mention is how close everything is. The Irish Sea, that's 50 miles across. If you look at the narrow space of ocean between Belfast and the Scottish coast, it's literally a little bit more than 20 miles from the Northern Irish coast across to Scotland. And so those countries have had a relationship for a very long time. But if you look at the four countries on this map, Scotland, England, Ireland, and Northern Ireland, and of course Wales, if you look at them, you are looking at a story that goes back to the year 1169, which is when the first invasion of Ireland by the Normans under the authority of the King of England, Henry II, when it took place. And so ever since that time, 1169, the countries have been linked to each other by history, by military domination, by different kinds of cultural links. And it hasn't been entirely disastrous. Both countries have benefited in many ways from the relationship with each other, but from time to time, it gets into a very rocky phase. And right now, the relationship between Ireland and the British government is not a happy one at all. And so there is enormous concern that Brexit is going to do considerable harm to the Irish economy. So let's think why that had to happen, or why that was destined to happen. In the first place, the Brexit not only is causing great fear over the last 4 or 5 years, it's not only causing that in Ireland, but also something that was not foreseen. Brexit in many ways is threatening the integrity of the United Kingdom because Brexit was not supported in the referendum by the Scots. It was not supported by the majority in Northern Ireland. It was certainly not supported by Irish people in the rest of Ireland, but they didn't have a say in the matter. So basically, Brexit represents something that none of us were really expecting, and that is the rebirth of English nationalism. And now there's been a lot about Scottish nationalism in the last 30 or 40 years, but the Scots have spent a long time thinking about how they might run their country if they became independent from England. And it's far from clear that they ever will. However, the situation in Brexit has created tension much worse than was there before. Now, if we look at Ireland, Northern Ireland was separated from the rest of Ireland politically in the year 1922. That was not a happy anniversary, or this is not a happy anniversary coming up in the next year. But in 1922, an agreement was signed between England, or between Britain, and the new Irish Free State, which basically all that part in the map that looks green, that's what is in it was the Irish Free State, then it became the Republic of Ireland. And so then you see Northern Ireland, that's colored orange on this map. And this is the area where much of the tension that you have been hearing about in the last couple of weeks, the tension is in Northern Ireland. And so Northern Ireland also had been part of the European Union, and actually the deal that Britain made with the European Union is that Northern Ireland remains in the European Union for customs purposes. And in that respect, Northern Ireland and Ireland, the Republic of Ireland, will not have any division except for the political differences that they have. But economically, each of them is independent and able to cooperate. It's very, very important because in the last few decades, the Irish and British and European economy has functioned in a way that is very reliant on supply chains. So if you eat a sandwich in England, there's some of the Republic of Ireland in that sandwich, there's some of Northern Ireland in that sandwich, there's some of England in that sandwich. And it could be things like butter, bread, meat, all of these things. And by the way, all of these things are enormous problems when you politically dissociate, because the European Union has what are called phytosanitary standards. The PHYTO sanitary standards are similar to the codes here in the United States that regulate the sale of and consumption of food. We all agree that our health is very much influenced by the quality of food and the ingredients in it. And so phytosanitary standards are something that are taken very seriously by the Europeans. And you may remember having heard about 20 years ago about something called mad cow disease. This was actually a new type of infectious agent called a prion, which infected cattle that were later exported from England into Germany. And the Germans said, if you have a disease in your cattle and you want to ship food and sell food in our country, you have to guarantee us that your food is clean and non-infectious. And the British were very unhappy about that. But the term phytosanitary standards has become a hugely important thing. It has an enormous economic impact. Okay, let's see. Can you go to the next slide, please? And so part of the idea of a Brexit has to do, of course, with a sense of national history. And if there is a notion that Britain is something separate from the rest of Europe, one only has to look at the image of Julius Caesar to realize that this man, Caesar, actually gave the name Britain to the islands. When Caesar came to Britain in 55 BC, he explored what is now England, and also he took a look at Scotland. And at that time, the island was inhabited by Celts and Picts. And actually, Celts were not a specific separate race of people. Celts were actually the indigenous people living in that part of the world. But they had very distinct characteristics, and Caesar was fascinated by them. Next picture. Now, Caesar named Britain, but didn't bother to visit Ireland. He did, however, name, or the Romans gave the name Hibernia. Hibernia, sort of where you hibernate to. Hibernia was supposed to be a land of perpetual winter. And so the Romans didn't think it was worth trying to conquer. If you look at that map today, it is an aspiration in the island that it be reunited into one. However, that would be a very, very tricky problem. And a first step was made by an important agreement that was made back 23 years ago called the Good Friday Agreement, in which an American president, Bill Clinton, an American envoy, George Mitchell, former senator from Maine, along with Tony Blair and a number of Southern Irish politicians, they hammered out an agreement that basically allowed for people in the south and the north of Ireland to enjoy common citizenship and complete travel access to England and to any part of Great Britain. They were also members of the European Union because Britain and Ireland had joined in the early 1970s. So suddenly, an old historic problem in Northern Ireland, a problem that goes back all the way to the year 1690, to the day, July the 12th, 1690. That's when the Catholic forces were defeated by a Protestant army led by King William of Orange. And his name is still celebrated in Northern Ireland. And there's a very passionate cause for the legacy that came from William of Orange. Next slide, if you please. Okay. However, if we take a look at modern Europe, it has its roots in a Celtic past. It has its roots also in the Roman Empire. It has roots in what was called the Holy Roman Empire, which succeeded the Roman Empire, which basically collapsed in the year 476. But if we take a look at Celtic Europe, it actually was, in some respects, a European entity. So I draw people's attention to a very fascinating book. I'm holding it up here. It's called Ancient Paths by Graham Robb, who's written some wonderful book on France. And so Ancient Paths is basically about the Celtic idea of Europe that they lived in. And so for the Celts, security was just as important as security was for the Romans. And so the ancient map of Europe is basically marked out by places identified by the Celts. And one of the terms that the Celts often used, they talked about a place of refuge, and they called that, or it was Latinized into Mediolanum. Mediolanum, as you can see, that eventually became Milan, but in fact, there were Mediolanums all over Europe, and they linked what is today Portugal all the way through Slovakia and on towards the Black Sea. So in fact, there was an idea of a common Europe that went back a couple of thousand years and beyond a couple of thousand years, because the Celts left traces of their ideas about travel. Okay, next picture if we. Okay, and so after the Romans fell apart, the next thing that came along was the Empire of Charlemagne. When all of Western Europe was threatened by invasions, people called Lombards, all of these disturbing influences called out for one strong figure. And so the strong figure that came along was a French or Frankish in those days king, the grandson of a king, and this was Charlemagne. And so at one point, this is where the idea of Europe begins to form in a very interesting way. But at one point, around the year 800, the Pope was threatened by the Lombards, and he reached out to the one strong person in Europe, and that was Charlemagne. And in fact, the Pope and his entire court decamped and went across the mountains to meet with Charlemagne around the year 800 AD. And when that meeting took place, there were enormous cultural results from that meeting, aside from the political arrangements that were made by the principals. But another thing that happened was that the Pope and his predecessors had been collecting religious music, and eventually they would develop a system for notation of music, but they were developing what they called a canon, or a regularized series of chants that would be sung and sung properly in celebration of religious services. Well, with Charlemagne came musicians from Flanders and from what is today France, but particularly from that region, Belgium, Holland, Luxembourg, and so forth. Wonderful, wonderful musicians who were fascinated by what the Romans were doing, but also they rejected the very orthodox way that the Vatican or the Pope's office organized music. So there was cultural interchange, which had an enormous impact on the future. Another thing that happened was after Charlemagne passed away, the development and the building of beautiful Gothic cathedrals took place all over Europe and in England too. And so if we take, for example, the historic church of Notre Dame in Paris, and why Victor Hugo wrote his famous book about that church, it was because in those days when very few people were literate, painting and stained glass and sculpture all helped to tell the story, the Christianity story as linked to the papacy. But Notre Dame was in fact a teaching tool. And that's what Victor Hugo wrote his book about, how if the written culture superseded what was there before it, something terrible would be lost. And that was something that reached back into antiquity. Next slide, if you please. Okay, and so the idea of some kind of unified Europe also persisted in countries like Austria. Austria today is a country of, I think, about 7 million people, but at the turn of the 20th century, Austria was a huge empire with many different countries, and Austria has been regarded by some as one of the most interesting political experiments ever done, because under one, well, it was called a dual monarchy between Hungary and Austria, but basically under one emperor, you had many, many different ethnic groups that were safely living under the authority of a single ruler, but he allowed quite a lot of democratization, and the Austrian Empire adapted to changes that were taking place in Europe. But one thing it couldn't adapt to was the ferocious nationalism that started in 1848, and then ultimately nationalists from Serbia killed the Austrian heir to the empire, and so that plunged the whole country into World War I. So the idea of Europe in the post-World War II era, the idea of Europe was something that would put an end to war. And one of the most practical ways of putting an end to war was to have peace between the two most powerful countries, France and Germany. And the way to guarantee that peace was to have a common ownership of coal and steel. And so the germ of the European community, the germ of the European Union, started around dealing with the antipathy that the French and the Germans had towards each other. Instead, they became partners. And that is one of the most amazingly successful stories in history. And that's the basis for the creation of the European Union. And it's also the part that the British have a great difficulty understanding its significance. They tend to dismiss the importance of the European relationship between France and Germany, and they see it more, the European Union, as something that you simply have as a trading bloc or an economic unit. Okay, next picture, if you please. Okay, so the union of the European states was a way of sharing sovereignty. Now, this word is terribly important because for Britain, the word sovereignty dominated the whole debate on Brexit. And it's very odd because in the first place, sovereignty is very dependent upon the amount of power and influence that you have to uphold your sovereignty. But countries like Ireland felt that the sovereignty of the country was enhanced by being in Europe because of all the opportunities that the Irish got through, for example, in the European Union, there's a program called the Erasmus program, named after the very distinguished scholar from the days of Martin Luther. But in the Erasmus program, every child or every young person in the European Union is allowed to have a free year of college education in any of the 27 European Union countries. You can go from Austria to Oxford, or as a cousin of mine did, from Ireland to Poland, where she got her veterinary degree later. So the thing is that for young people in Europe, this opportunity created by the Erasmus program, it's a very clever way and a very beneficial way of learning about the continent that you're part of. And so again, Britain has been a major beneficiary of the Erasmus program because so many people want to come to British universities. But that, and also the end of the European research grants for Britain. By taking itself out of the European Union, Britain basically lost something called the European Medicines Board, which was $1 billion operation that regulated health-related activity all over the European Union. That went, and it's now in Amsterdam. So it was one of the things that was lost with Brexit. Have the next slide, if you please. Okay. The time to do the right thing was right after World War II. At that time, the two great superpowers that emerged from the war, the United States and the Soviet Union, they were clearly going to have enormous clout in the decades that lay ahead. Britain, on the other hand, though on the winning side and having fought a magnificent war, if one can say it that way, but Britain, on the other hand, no longer had the economic power to act like an empire. It needed to think in a way. So the top scientific advisor to Britain, Sir Henry Tizard, told the British government at the end of the war that you can be a great nation, but you cannot be a great power because you don't have economic strength sufficient to do that. However, Sir Henry Tizard was not listened, and May I have the next slide? I have the next slide after this one, which will take us to what happened right after his. So Sir Henry's advice was rejected, and Britain got itself into a war over the Suez Canal. How interesting that we're hearing about the Suez Canal in recent weeks when we had a very clear demonstration that it is one of the most important economic arteries in the world. But Britain actually was the owner of the Suez Canal, the major investor. And then the Egyptian president of the time, Gamal Nasser, took over the canal and proposed to take a much larger share of the revenue. This upset the British to the point that they involved themselves in a military occupation, and that caused enormous annoyance in Washington. And Washington told the English Prime Minister, Sir Anthony Eden, that it was time to get out of Suez. That was an enormous humiliation. That was a disaster. And ironically, at the very same time, in the very same year of 1956, may I have the next slide? Okay, at 1956, something new was happening in Europe, and Britain had an opportunity to be involved. Britain actually had an opportunity to dominate this new European Union, but it decided not to. That meant that when Britain eventually entered the European Union, an enormous amount of law had already been created for the European countries by the European countries, and Britain hadn't been at the table because it chose not to be. Now, the people who had the great insight that has given us peace in Europe since World War II were two Frenchmen, Jean Monnet, who came from Cognac in France, who came from the area around Charente. He and the French Prime Minister and Foreign Minister, Robert Schuman, these two gentlemen worked with Konrad Adenauer, who was the German Chancellor at that time, and they worked out this agreement to share in resources and manufacturing and processing of coal and steel. So they linked their two economies in such a way that you couldn't take them apart. And this was the germ of the European Union. The British often referred to it as an economic arrangement, but actually it was a much bigger thing than that. It was about national security, it was about international security, and it was why the logic for Brexit is very flawed. Next picture. So what is so fascinating is Winston Churchill, whose enormous appreciation of the importance of history, as well as being a very big part of history, he was already thinking about a united Europe. And he wrote a note to his own government in 1942, just when the war was just beginning to turn because of the involvement of the United States, but also because Hitler got bogged down in Russia. So around this time, it became clear to Churchill that some kind of post-war arrangement involving many nations was important. The trouble was that even Churchill was divided in his own mind. As much as he saw the necessity for it, in his heart, he was also very English, and he wasn't too comfortable with the idea of being part of a European Union, even though he was the most distinguished advocate for it. Next picture. And so after the British got themselves into a terrible mess in Suez in 1956, here on the island of Sicily, in the province of Messina, representatives from 6 countries met to discuss what would become the Treaty of Rome. The Treaty of Rome linked the economic activities of France, Germany, Italy, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg. All of them joined in together. The British were invited, and a British diplomat called Russell Bretherton went to Messina and participated in the conference. But at the end of the conference, Mr. Bretherton told the Europeans, don't do what you're planning to do. It'll be a disaster. It won't work, and we won't be part of it. And so that was a very cold brush off going back to 1956. And of course, the Europeans didn't listen to Mr. Bretherton. They went ahead and they signed the Treaty of Rome. And with that, two of the biggest players, Germany headed by Adenauer and France headed by de Gaulle, a great historic figure, as prominent and as important as Churchill in his own way, a great nation builder. So they put together something that has stood from the end of World War II and is very strong today. Next picture. Okay, so the Germans at that time were very eager to be close to Britain politically, and they wanted the British to see themselves as Europeans, as Adenauer would say to Churchill, you are part, England is part of Europe. Next slide, if you please. Okay, so the Prime Minister of England who agreed was Harold Macmillan, and he made an effort to get the British into the European Union, only to run into opposition from de Gaulle. Next picture. When Harold Macmillan approached de Gaulle, he had spoken to one of his own top legal minds, a gentleman called David Maxwell Fyfe, who then became Lord Kilmuir. And he asked Lord Kilmuir to advise him on the impact of the European Union on British sovereignty. And so Lord Kilmuir said to Prime Minister Macmillan, if you do enter the European Union, you'd better talk to the British people about the sovereignty issue, because there are some things of concern. Parliament would have to accept rulings by the European Union Council of Ministers. That's the logic of a supranational organization. Britain would have to accept European treaties, because once you sign a treaty, it becomes the law of the land. And then the European Court of Justice would be the final arbiter on judicial matters. Now, this should have been very clearly explained to the British people back in the early 1970s, but it wasn't. And so that meant later that people who opposed the European Union would be able to say, well, you didn't really adequately discuss the impact of this on sovereignty. Okay, next picture, if you please. And here we have General de Gaulle, who was a man very concerned about French sovereignty, and yet he was part of the European Union. As a general, as someone who'd experienced very tough times in World War II, he wanted to protect French sovereignty as much as he could, but he was willing to pool French and German sovereignty for the greater cause of peace between the countries. Now, the image on the left is de Gaulle in 1940 making a historic speech, which was broadcast by the BBC to French-speaking people all over the world. It was de Gaulle's attempt to rally the French around England and the United States. Next picture, if you please. And so, I guess I'm getting some interference, but in In 1962, after the Treaty of Rome was successfully implemented, a historic meeting took place in Reims, in the great cathedral at Reims, the place where all French kings were crowned. Adenauer and de Gaulle got together, and this is a very symbolic photograph. This is a symbolic photograph of the union that was achieved between these two countries that had spent many, many centuries fighting each other. Okay, next picture, if you please. Okay, so after Macmillan had been refused admittance to the European community, de Gaulle lost power, and along came a new British Prime Minister, Edward Heath, who was elected in 1970. And Heath was a man who was passionately European. He had been in the Spanish Civil War, representing Britain. He had been there as an observer, and he'd spent years in Spain seeing how devastating war could be. He was in Poland in 1939, right up to the time of the Nazi invasion of Poland. Edward Heath managed to get out of Poland and get back to Britain, and he was involved in the war effort. But there is no English prime minister who was as passionate about the European connection. Also, Heath was a musician. He'd gone to Oxford on a scholarship to be trained in playing the organ. He was a very fine musician, and his love of music and his musical capability brought him all over Europe and made him very much a European at heart. However, he was prime minister only for 4 years, and during that time, they did get the European Union established, and Britain became a member of the European Union. On the right side of the photograph is his rival, Harold Wilson, Labour Prime Minister, who recognized that while the European Union was absolutely necessary, popular with everybody. And so, when I say it wasn't popular, a lot of people in Wilson's own party, the Labour Party, they weren't too happy. And indeed, some of the Brexit voters in 2016 were people from the Labour Party, Harold Wilson's party. So Harold Wilson decided to do something that had almost never been done in English history, and that is to go to the people not for an election, but for a referendum. So a referendum on the relationship of Britain and Europe actually took place. I think it was 1975. And so that referendum resulted in a 2-to-1 majority in favor of entering the European Union. Now, something very important happened just prior to that referendum. The government produced a very thoughtful, carefully argued document in explaining to the British people what this union was going to be all about. That document ended up being the most heavily sold publication ever by a British government. So many people took it home and read it and studied it, and then came and voted 2-to-1 in favor of the European Union. So why did things go so badly in the year 2016? May I have the next picture, please? Okay. So the prime minister who came in 1979, Margaret Thatcher, believed in the European Union as an economic union, but she waved away the national security implications. She got into a lot of arguments with the Europeans because she felt that Britain was contributing too much. And so they actually gave her a deal back in 1984, which was very favorable and which tilted things in a much more agreeable way towards Britain. And so that was a big victory for her. However, she wanted to leave her mark on Europe. And so she set out to champion something called the Single European Act. And this is the idea of having one big European market protected by a customs union. That was her contribution to this whole process. But there was a side of her which was very, shall we say, argumentative. And so some of the Brexit type language goes back to her and some of her supporters. And after she lost power, many of the people who remained loyal to her were becoming increasingly critical of the idea of a European Union. Next picture. One of the people who realized how dangerous all this was the French Jacques Delors. And Mr. Delors said that he, as a member of labor unions, we have to struggle against conservatism from all sides, not only right-wingers, but also the left. And in many respects, the Brexit situation was one where people on the right and the left had some common cause in being very critical of Europe, but nobody had a very clear explanation. And unfortunately, instead of having the kind of carefully prepared referendum that took place back in 1975, in 2016, the government of David Cameron assumed that they would win, and they didn't put enough thought and effort into averting the catastrophe, which I have no hesitation in calling Brexit a catastrophe, because that's what I believe it is. Can we go to the next picture, please? Okay, so if you, I'd like to say something about symbols of the European Union. The European Union has 12 stars, but it has 27 members. So why did it not do what the United States did and added, every time a new state came in, they added a star? Well, Europeans proceeded from a somewhat different assumption. They had the view that the number 12 represented a kind of harmony, and that 12 was an ideal number, and so that's why they decided to have just the 12 stars. Let me just look at my, yes. Oh yes, there's, that's a very interesting question. I see a question that's come in from Nigel Wolf. Hi, Nigel, nice to hear from you. Your question reads, Brexit came to a head with the vote in June 2016. 6 months later, Trump was elected president. Both events reflected the sentiment of nationalism at that time. Could Brexit have happened without Trump? That's a really interesting question. I have a clear recollection of my colleague Nigel Calcutt coming back from England in 2016. And it was just a few days after the referendum. And he said to me, better watch out, Trump's going to get elected. So yeah, I don't know that I can answer the question, could Brexit have happened without Trump? But one only has to take a look at the kind of arguments and also the imagery that was prevalent in the 2016 election. And that brings me to Boris Johnson. Boris Johnson is somebody who has enjoyed the political role of being a troublemaker. In fact, there's a very interesting article that appeared in the Guardian Weekly a couple of weeks ago called The Clown Prince. And it's about Boris Johnson's decision or his lifelong activity, making fun of politics, making fun of himself, being a figure that suggested that the role of the clown or the jester, that was in some way a substitute for the role of a serious statesperson, somebody who tackled problems and tried to make their country a better place. So I'm reminded that Boris Johnson, at the beginning of his political career, he published a book called 72 Virgins. And in that book, he said, the hero of his book, 72 Virgins, was a man called Roger Barlow. And so, although you asked me about Trump, I'm just going to read this piece, which is not about Trump, but could describe the behavior of Trump. And so at the conclusion of Boris Johnson's novel, he says, to a man like Roger Barlow, the whole world seems like a complicated joke. Everything was always up for grabs, capable of dispute, and religion, law, principle are just, and customs, these are nothing but sticks from the wayside to support our faltering steps. So that is what I would call a very nihilistic statement. And the objection I have towards Trump was the nihilism of the man. And so if I can answer your question that way, I think the alter ego of Trump was Boris Johnson, and Boris Johnson was the one who chose to write a book. He didn't have it ghostwritten for him. I see another question. So is the real question, could Trump have been elected if Brexit had not happened? Well, it certainly didn't help, would be my observation. In fact, the Brexit vote represented a lot of things. First of all, Britain has only had 3 referenda in all these years. So the Brexit vote was the 3rd referendum in British history. Now, just think here in California, how many times have we voted on initiatives and referenda and so forth? Well, many, many times. It's part of our way of governing, as messy as it is. But in other European countries like Ireland and the Netherlands and Denmark and so forth, referenda are commonly held. It's an accepted way of seeking advice from the public. And so when David Cameron, who was the Prime Minister of England under this, at the time, after being defeated in the referendum, he surrendered, he resigned as Prime Minister the very next day. But when he held that referendum, he had been warned by the Irish Prime Minister, who was very friendly with him and who said, you know, David, you'd better watch out. Referenda are something we have quite a bit of experience here in Ireland. And if the voters decide to kick your ass, that's how it will happen. They'll vote against you in a referendum. These are very dangerous things. And so Cameron, by that stage, he wasn't able to call the thing off. Although I think legally he would have gotten away with calling it off, but it would have gotten him into a lot of trouble. But instead of him getting into trouble, his whole country now is in extraordinary trouble. And I'm reading, let me read a question that came from Jack Fisher for later. Okay, I see that's a note in which the implications are being discussed. Let me just, may I have the next slide? The consequences of Brexit are now playing out for England in a very, very disturbing way. What has happened is basically when you take away the customs union and when you take Britain out of the single European Act that Margaret Thatcher negotiated, when you do all of that, there are economic consequences. And those consequences for Britain right now, things like the fishing industry in Scotland and in what's called the West Country, the west coast of Wales and England. The fisheries have been devastated because people cannot get their product to market in sufficient time now that European customs are in place and everything is subject to phytosanitary standards. So this is really a very, very devastating thing. Just to give you an example, a major importer of wine into Britain, Daniel Lambert, exporting or importing 2 million bottles of wine every year to 300 different distributors in the UK. It's all ground to a halt. Again, because the paperwork is so very complicated. So in the campaign for the referendum, the villain was always Brussels. Everything was about Brussels. But now Brussels can no longer be used as a slogan because Brussels has no authority anymore. It's now Westminster. But the real problem is Britain has its own very cumbersome bureaucracy, and that bureaucracy is now dealing with the situation in a very unhappy way. Next picture, if you please. So two people who warned not only before but after Brexit, Tony Blair and John Major, these two gentlemen were very strong believers in Europe, but there's an issue that I haven't mentioned so far. I'd better mention the issue of immigration, because remember when we had a war in Iraq and Tony Blair aligned himself with George W. Bush, and afterwards Tony Blair was asked by the Americans to open up the European Union to new members like Poland and Slovakia. Well, that happened, and that meant that 700,000 people immigrated from Poland and 400,000 immigrated from Slovakia. And so it was this immigration that was used as a major card against Brexit. May I have the next picture, if you please? Okay, now in the middle of all this very sad and disturbing stuff, there are some things that one can see that remind one of the England that we all knew and liked very much. And that is the beautiful tribute to a difficult situation in Salisbury Cathedral recently. The whole cathedral was turned over to become a great vaccine center. And while the injections were being given, the organist was playing music that was well loved by people. And this is kind of the image of an England that one would really like to have. But let me tell you that a piece in The Guardian just a couple of weeks ago about a German literature professor called Christoph Fricker. He immigrated to Britain during the European Union era. He came into Britain, got a job at Bristol University, fell in love with England, and wrote a book in German called 111 Reasons to Love England. And so recently, his book became very popular among his colleagues. And so he wrote to his publisher back in Germany and said, can we have some more copies of the book? And the answer was no. We don't plan to print anymore because the whole situation is so confusing right now that we have no idea what tariffs, what extra costs would be. Therefore, we're not going to give you any more of your book. In a way, that is kind of emblematic of this situation in Brexit. Can I have the next slide, please? Yeah, Salisbury Cathedral. And again, a reminder of Britain's European past, because the Gothic cathedrals were not only England, but France, and all over the European Union, but the most beautiful ones, England, France, and Germany. Next picture, please. David Cameron, he was in the news a couple of days ago, something to do with fiscal irregularity, but he had the misfortune to preside over a very unhappy campaign. And I think in many ways, since the Suez Canal, Brexit has been the most impactful event, and it's playing out and will continue playing out for quite a while. Next picture. Johnson is, I'm afraid, an example of somebody who got in over his head, and he was writing for an English newspaper, and he got fired because of printing stuff that wasn't reporting. It was just fiction. It was stuff he made up. And on the very same day that he was fired from the newspaper, he got an opportunity to get a job as a columnist for a much higher salary. So now he realized that he could do much better telling stories and playing the clown than doing the really hard, serious work that's involved in being a prime minister. May I have the next picture, if you please? What are the things that are really basic to the European Union? They're called the four freedoms. The movement of goods, services, capital, and persons within the EU. What has happened is that ancient atavistic fears about immigration have helped torpedo one of the most satisfactory economic agreements in the post-war era. May I have the next slide, if you please? Okay, so in all of this, it's fortunate for Europe that there are two very able leaders, Chancellor Angela Merkel, who's now 16 years in office, but who has done a great deal to keep Europe safe, stable, economically healthy, and to show a compassionate face towards immigrants. I think that she's one of the really significant European leaders of our time. And then Macron is, he's got to fight an election next year, but he's very firmly aligned, just as the European coal and steel community were aligned back in the post-war era. So that's the hope. Next picture, if you please. The whole issue of Brexit has made people very, very sad. And one of them is the French ambassador, Sylvie Berman, who said, when you've admired a country for a long time, appreciated its humor, tolerance, of course it's sad, she says. It also means now, she goes on, there's no more jelly and Stilton in Marks and Spencer in Marché Saint-Germain. That's Brexit too. So next picture, if you please. Yes, this is a lady who, just like Christoph Fricker, who wrote the book 111, people in Europe have a real affection for the England that they've known. It's just much harder to recognize an England where even now racist type abuse is being hurled at the Irish, who of course have been intimately involved with England for 900 years or so. So Sylvie Berman, it's very rare for anyone who's a career diplomat to call a political leader a liar, but that's what she's doing about Boris Johnson. And that's what many of us who hated and rejected everything to do with Trump feel, that the man regarded the truth as just of no significance. And so when Sylvie Berman says lying is no longer a sin, it's that has a resonance in our lives too. Next picture. And it's the last few words I would like to say is Theresa May, a recent British Prime Minister, tried very hard to deal with the situation in Northern Ireland. Part of what makes Brexit such a misfortunate thing is that it stirred up ancient disputes and bitterness in Ireland, things which had been taken care of by the Good Friday Agreement 23 years ago. But instead, Brexit has now inflamed hostilities so that you see images on television of buses burning and buildings burning. And unfortunately, in Northern Ireland, there are two sides which don't hesitate to provoke the police and to encourage kids to throw rocks and do stuff like this. So what had been a very stable situation now has been thrown into chaos in Northern Ireland. Now, it's very interesting that in Northern Ireland, the loyalist majority that are no longer a majority. Ireland has had a census which shows now that the nationalists and Catholics are more numerous. And that has political significance in a country that accepts parliamentary government. Also, there has been a refusal in Northern Ireland to engage with the Irish government, but now they're going to have to do that in the spirit of the Good Friday Agreement, because that made provision for communication between London, Belfast, and Dublin. But all three had to be players. And so I think Southern Irish people are very, very concerned at the moment. They are very frightened of the way Brexit has been handled, and they are trusting that the French and the Germans will have their back at a time when Britain is behaving very irrationally. Okay, next picture, if you please. So part of what made Brexit possible was fake news, and some of the British newspapers, they have been, the tabloid newspapers, these have said the most reckless things. These are the kind of venues where people like Boris Johnson gets to publish stuff. And so they supported Brexit. Some of these papers are owned by press barons like Rupert Murdoch. Well, Rupert Murdoch, if he walks into an office in Brussels, nobody pays any attention to him. But if he walks into an office of a politician in London, he gets great deference. And so he's had an outsized influence, and it's been a destructive and disruptive influence. I think that is one of the great sadness. Next slide, if you please. The fake news included things that 350 million British pounds per month were going to the European Union. It wasn't true. And it could be used to finance the NHS. That wasn't true either. It was said that Turkish immigrants would come in droves. They couldn't, because Turkey is not a member of the European Union. Therefore, Turkish immigrants could not come. And then there were all kinds of ridiculous things. So I see a question here. When did it join? Britain joined the European Union in the early 1970s. Okay, next picture. Okay, so the great paradox is that if you look at the Union Jack, the union that is symbolized here is England, Wales, Scotland, and Ireland. What has happened in recent times is that the flag now is the flag of St. George, which is just one red cross. So it's a very different looking, but that union actually took place in 1707. That's when the union was solemnized between England and Scotland. The union with Ireland was forced upon the Irish in the year 1800, and then they fought for their independence, which they obtained in 1922. The issue of sovereignty has been very good for the Irish, and you wonder why it should be so bothersome to the British. But I guess there's, just like we have American exceptionalism, there's also a strong notion in Britain that it's an exceptional country, and in many ways, it's culturally true, but not politically. Okay. Thank you very much for hearing this. I apologize for going over my time, but I would be delighted to answer more questions.